Okay, I hope we're all doing well.
Hi, Professor. Good evening. How you doing?
Good, Muazzil, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for asking.
Muaz, sorry. Um, okay, all right, so I just messaged Muaz that, I think it was Muaz. Oh, no, Sabita, that I was extending the due date for the required discussion board 2 days. I have papers to grade anyway next 2 days, so I won't be able to get to it.
Professor, question. I didn't get it. So for the discussion board, the one is due today. You're gonna extend it to Tuesday, right?
To Tuesday night, okay, so you have 2 extra days. I don't know if that'll help or not, but
Will help. Thank
hopefully
you.
it does. Good, all right. I will take attendance. I'll start with the attendance this time. Minhas. Is Minhas here? Muez is I just talked to a second ago. Dana.
Hello, I'm here.
Hello, Dana. Karina.
Good night, Professor. How are you?
Good, Karina. How are you?
Good.
I'm glad to hear that. Derek. Derek Borut. Derek Borut.
Here, Professor. Hello.
Hello. Xiaolin Chen.
Here, Professor. Hi.
Hi. Naisha Sherry. Naisha? No, here comes Naisha now, even as we speak. Okay, I'll hold off on Naisha. Tyler Daly.
I'm in.
Hello, Tyler. Charles DeBross.
Here.
Hello, Charles. Caitlin. Caitlin Dingman.
Here.
Hello, Caitlin. Naisha Sherry.
Here.
Hello, Naisha. Reham.
Here.
Hello. Fatima.
Here.
Hello. Joanne Frazier.
Here.
Hello. Raquel Gray. Raquel. Okay. You're absent. Gabrielle Huggins. Gabrielle Huggins. Brian Joseph. Brian Joseph. Maimuna Kabir. Maimuna. Salma Kahanam. Hello? Salma? Okay. Catherine Kim.
Here.
I was beginning to worry that the speaker was broken. Clinton Kenyeti. Clinton.
Here.
Hello, Clinton. Ilya
Here.
Korolev.
Good night, Professor. I'm here.
Hello, Ilya. Billy Kryam. Billy Kryam. Shanice Lawson.
Here, Professor.
Hello, Shanice. Alex Lee.
Here, Professor.
Ava Luke.
Here.
Hello, Lisbeth Martinez.
Here, Professor.
Hello, Lisbeth. Kevin Metacastro.
Here, Professor.
Hello, Kevin. Barbara Mendick.
Good evening, Professor. I'm here.
Hi, Barbara. Leonie Miller.
Good evening, Professor.
Good evening. Jacqueline Mills.
Hello, I'm here.
Hello. Judy Mizrachi. Judy, not here. Okay, Jessica Moon,
Hi, I'm here.
hello. Oriana Mora,
Hello, I'm here.
hello, Oriana. Hamza Nadeem,
Here.
hello. Anthony Nagoyan,
Here.
hello. Diana Owusu,
Yeah, Professor.
Sabita Pekayari. Sabita,
evening, Professor. I'm here.
okay, Sabita, yeah, you sent the message before.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Sapir Rafaelov,
Right here.
okay. Shakira Risher,
I'm here, Professor.
hello. Eliza Silks. Anastasia Stepanova. Zixuan Su,
Here.
hello. Nahima Sultana. Nahima. Watson Taylor, Rayvon Watson Taylor. Okay, Mike Williams. Michael. Bin Wu,
I'm here.
very good. Steve Kaplan. Yang Wei Wu,
I'm here.
hello. And last but not least, Yagladier.
I'm here.
Hello. Okay, so basically I'll try to read off the absent people's names. If I don't call you, it means I mark you present. Raquel Gray, Gabriel Huggins, Ryan Joseph, Maimuna Kabir, Salma Kahanam, Billy Kryam, Judy Mizrachi, Anastasia Stepanova. Where was I? Oh, Eliza Silks, Nahima Sultana, and Michael Williams. Okay, here's Brian Joseph. I will mark him present. Brian, you with us? Brian?
Here.
Okay. All right, so tonight,
Hi, I joined on the wrong name, but I'm here as Gabby. Gabrielle, sorry.
Gabrielle, last name?
Huggins.
Oh, right, okay. All right, I got you now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so basically, tonight we're going to discuss teams, teamwork, not so much teamwork as the structure and processes of teams. And basically, I mean, to function well in teams, you have to communicate well. I mean, teamwork is communication, but I think it's also complementarity. Like there was a great movie called Moneyball about a baseball team out west that they hired this economist, this young economist, who figured out that if you hire baseball players who complement each other's skills, that they can compete successfully with much more expensive teams that don't complement each other's skills, but just have really good players. So like, you know, like the better baseball teams have like the most stars. But what this guy realized was that you don't have to be the very top players, but if you hire like a guy who gets a lot of singles and another guy who also gets a lot of singles, then, or who walks a lot, and then you follow him up with the guy who gets singles, you can get enough runs to win, even though these players are not stars in themselves, but if they have complementary abilities that they can win. And the baseball teams probably pride themselves on their teamwork, but this idea was absolutely alien. The way the film predicts it, I assume there's truth to it. The scouts and the manager were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe that mere teamwork could overcome ability, individual ability. Of course, individual ability is important. We talked about that, but teamwork can be more important. And very often it's not the group with the most capable people, but the team that plays the best. So I highly recommend that film Moneyball. I'll send you the link when I send the email around. So basically, teamwork, I think, has a lot to do with coordination. I think also 12 o'clock high, which some of you may be thinking about writing the paper at this point. It's the first draft is due in 2 weeks. A lot of the story was how do we work together to form a flying fortress, a unit. And basically what he encouraged them to do is to focus on the team rather than feel sorry for themselves. And I mean, that's part of what task-oriented leadership is, that you get everyone to focus on the task and building the team. So I think teamwork has a lot to do with building on complementarities across the group. Now, what do I mean by a group? In OB, we have a somewhat specialized meaning. It's not that surprising, but basically a group of people has to be working on a goal. They're interdependent, interacting individuals who are working to achieve a goal. So there's 2 or more people, they interact, they associate to achieve a goal. And basically, like if you think about it, I just got off the subway, and if you look at a subway car, that is not a group, because people are not generally interacting, except for the occasional song and dance person looking for money or something. But basically, the people are in the subway car not interacting, and they're certainly not trying to achieve a goal. So it's not a group. If you have a line waiting to get into a clothing store, which I see in my neighborhood sometimes, that is not a group. Okay, so basically part of what happens in a group is the inverse, if you will, of social categorization theory that we talked about when we talked about diversity. Social categorization refers to a process by which people make sense of others by stereotyping them. They construct social categories and they blame different behaviors on the categorizations that they create. Social identity theory kind of reverses that and says that it asks, like, why do people view themselves as belonging to a different group? And we all do. I mean, we all belong, whether it could be an ethnic group, or it could be a religious group, or it could be even an age group, or any kind of social group, the group of chess players or whatever, the political parties, Democrats and Republicans. And that's becoming actually more important than anything else. I've read research done in the last 10 years or so where they find that there are actually more interracial marriages than inter-party marriages. That people are more and more categorizing themselves by political party. And, that becomes part of their identity. Now, it's also useful now, of course, in organizations, it's going to be different. There, I think departmentalization plays a big role. So this idea of formal organization was identified by a number of early managerial theorists. Henri Fayot, the French industrialist, who wrote a book called Administration, and he distinguished between the the formal organization, what came to be called FAO's Bridge, the informal organization that ties people together, even though they're not in the same chain of command. And you could also look at something called what Chester Barnard called the informal organization. Okay, and that's the term your textbook uses. So the formal organization would be the chain of command, and that's partially the model of FAO, which I'll put it on the screensaver for a second. So FAO talked about, there's a chain of command like a pyramid shape, and FAO's bridge is when people interact across the chain of command. Okay, Chester Barnard talked about something a little different, which is that there are always informal organizations that are not on the organizational chart. And so there are going to be some aspects of an organization that form independently, even though the top management didn't anticipate these little groups forming. And there could be a lot of reasons. Part of it may be that there are ad hoc groups. And by the way, matrix organizations, which we'll talk about later in the semester, try to anticipate this by having two types of organizations. So in other words, there's the chain of command, and it could be pyramid shaped like that, but there's also functional reporting. So you have like a matrix, and so you have a top-down report and a functional report, like a team report. So basically, this is a way to integrate teamwork into the hierarchy. But organizations have become much more spontaneous with the gig economy. And a lot of the question of whether someone identifies with a group probably has to do with emotional factors. Gig workers tend to be less identified, but they can start to identify with I once did some expert witness work for a prestigious law firm in Chicago. And I remember they said, they introduced me to someone who was new at the firm, and I said, "Oh, welcome to the firm." I wasn't even part of the firm. I just said it. And, I said to me, "What the hell am I saying? I'm not even in this firm," but kind of like one of the things that encourages identification with an organization is like, if the organization is prestigious, then like gig workers will tend to want to associate with it. And that, that's it. If you're like doing some consulting work for a movie studio that's really famous, DreamWorks or something. And so, you tell everyone, "Oh, I'm working with DreamWorks," it's natural that you're going to sort of be, tend to want to identify with it. But there are other factors too. I mean, if they're nice to you, if they treat you well, and if you're working on tasks that are engaging and so on. So basically, if your self-esteem gets tied to a group of people, then you're going to tend to identify with the group. When I worked for J&J, I worked for J&J, Johnson & Johnson, for a few years in the early 80s. It was at the time of the Tylenol crisis. In fact, I was there when the Tylenol crisis occurred. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's kind of old now, but the Tylenol crisis was when a guy, some unknown person, they never caught him, was injecting cyanide into bottles of Tylenol, and people were buying the Tylenol and dying when they took. So, that was a big thing and a very interesting business problem in its own right. And what they did was they replaced all the bottle. They recalled every single bottle of Tylenol, and then they redesigned the bottle. So now you can't open bottles. When you buy a bottle of something, it always has that stuff that sticks down the cap. That's where that came from. Like the sticky stuff you have to tear off, because that's where that came from. There was some nutty serial killer who was injecting capsules with cyanide and then putting them back in the bottle. But anyway, that's just an aside. what was I saying? I lost the track of what I was talking about. But I forgot what I was saying, but anyways, so if your esteem is associated with an organization, you're gonna tend to be loyal to that organization. And so social identity theory tries to pinpoint some of these occurrences. Gig workers, of course, tend to be less identified, but you can shift that around. A really interesting problem is expatriates. Generally, expatriates tend to associate with their home countries, but that can change over time. And if someone's transplanted a temporary assignment that lasts, say, 10 or 20 years, they can start to reassess their identity and associate more with the host country, the country they're visiting, rather than their home country, the country they come from. One of the big problems with identification with smaller groups is that the process can lead to conflict. So you can have polarization because in groups and out groups start to fight with each other and they don't get along and they're competing with each other. Virtually every company I worked at, there was always some conflict between departments. So like I would work with, I was in HR, but the departments I worked with were more in, there was the treasury department. I'd often work with the finance people and accounting and legal. So I'd work with a few like other departments. At J&J, I worked with the labor people. We usually got along okay with at least I did with the labor people. I kind of identify with, a similar thing, but we, a lot of the time we have conflicts with the finance department. They were, they were somewhat different culture kind of. So basically, it varies from company to company, but the idea is that, people tend to identify with their departments, and they also tend to identify with various subgroups. So you might be from different departments, but you're both working on the same project. So you start to tie in. One of the big issues with subgroup identification is that it can lead to discrimination. So like people who associate with a given subgroup will tend to want to associate with others from that subgroup. And again, this, this political divide in America now is very interesting. There was a study where a researcher presented resumes that were the same except for the political identification of the person, they didn't make it overt, but they buried in the resume that the person was identified with one party or the other. And then they sent the resumes to different counties that were predominantly one party or the other party. And what they found was that the people associated with the same party as the county were far more likely to be hired, or to be called in, not hired, but to be called in for an interview by the company in those counties. So in other words, if you were a Republican applying, if you were applying in a Republican, not you, if the resume was Republican and it was sent to a Republican county firm, they would be much more likely to be called in than if you were a Democrat being sent to a Republican county firm. And the reverse was even as true, that if you were a Democrat and you were being sent to a Democratic county, you were more likely to be called in than if you were a Republican being sent to a Democratic county. So basically, this is the kind of thing. It's not just with that, but with anything. And of course, studies of racial discrimination have often found, and this is something I observed, like when I started working in the early 70s, not early, mid 70s. In 76, I started an international nickel company. I noticed that the different departments within the company were all the same ethnic group. So basically, like there were a lot of the hires within groups was being done with some bias. There was bias, obviously, and I've seen this in academia as well. So basically, I don't really believe it's because of intentional discrimination or hostility, but rather because of favoritism. People like to hire people like them. It's not necessarily conscious. So that's something to think about and be aware of. So basically, now how do groups form? And I think one of the things you can ask about 12 o'clock high is to what degree was the 918th unit a group? I think it was, but they were trying to achieve a goal. It was more than one individual. But I think they also had subgroups, which is why he rotated the pilots across roommates. He changed the roommates. So they were a group, but there were also differences between most kinds of groups because it was purely a formal group. I mean, they had a very strict formal structure, and they don't really show you what the subgroups were or how the pilots of the individual, the pilots and the staff of the individual planes interacted, or whether the pilots tend to associate mostly with themselves. That wasn't really clarified in the film, but I think a lot of what the movie is about is a kind of restructuring of a group by a leader, and redefining roles and redefining norms of the group. And we'll talk about norms in a second, but basically, if you look at, you could say that groups have processes and they have structure. And the processes are how they form, how they interact. And a model I've used a lot in the past, your book mentions, is forming, storming, norming, and performing. And in that model, like first the group interacts, they conflict, there's some conflict, they create norms or standards, and then they get down to problem solving, to functioning, if you will. Did the 918 follow that model? Well, they had already formed, so it wasn't a spontaneous group in that sense. They did have norms, but the intervention of the appointment of Savage meant that he was tasked with changing the norms. Was there storming? There was a hell of a lot of storming. And the end result was the performing. So basically, I think what 12 o'clock high kind of emphasizes is the reformulation of the norms based on the forming of the new relationship with the new bond with the new leader, which then caused new norms to evolve after in the course of a lot of conflict. And that in turn led to them becoming much more effective. The other model, and this is a more or sort of business-oriented model, specifically that is very useful. Your book presents a broad outline of it, called the punctuated equilibrium model. Punctuated equilibrium is a term borrowed from biology. And one of my professors, when I was a doctoral student at Columbia, Mike Tushman, who later went on to teach at Harvard for many years, wrote an important paper on the punctuated equilibrium model of organizations. And this kind of takes the same concept, but applies it to the processes behind group dynamics. And so basically the punctuated equilibrium model says that an initial meeting will set the direction of the group, and then there's a long period of inertia. I'm currently mentoring a senior who's working on a senior thesis, and I told her like to try to overcome this long inertia period that typically occurs after the task begins, that she should write up 5 articles a week and send me the summaries. So in other words, she should read 5 articles about her subject every week and send me the summary. So she starts building a set of references that she can use in her thesis. But it's hard to overcome this kind of initial inertia because people tend to put off for tomorrow what they can do today. It's a very bad habit, but we all have it. And basically, I think a lot of the way to overcome that is to set goals. So in other words, goal setting and the idea of small wins, that you set small tasks like I did for her, and you try to accomplish a little bit at a time. That enables you to get things done over time. Typically though, in groups, the first meeting sets the direction and then there's inertia. Half the time goes by, at the halftime, major changes, and then there's a second phase of inertia, and then the last meeting has accelerated activity. So the picture on page 271 of your book looks a little like this. Where's my, oh, here it is, my whiteboard. So it looks a little like this, where, all right, so we clear. And so it starts out, there's a long period of, so I would add this little bump. You start the initial meeting, you get something done. You have inertia for a long time, you don't do a lot. Then at the halftime, you bump it up, you do a lot more inertia. And then the final rush to completion at the end. So basically that's called the punctuated equilibrium model. The idea of punctuated equilibrium, as I say, comes from biology, and it's an idea in evolutionary theory, I guess you'd call it, that of which I know very little, that the way evolution occurs among species is that there's a rapid change and then a long period of stability and then another rapid change. I think an example might be the extinction of the dinosaurs due to, I think the current theory is that there was some kind of solar event, like some, I don't know what they call like collision. There was some collision event that caused a blackout of the sun for a long period of time. In other words, there's, when the asteroid or whatever was hit the Earth, there was a huge amount of debris, and it took a year or two to clear up, and it starved a lot of the dinosaurs to death. They were so big that they couldn't survive without ingestion of food. Basically, that would be like the punctuation, and then there'd be a long equilibrium thereafter with, I suppose, smaller species or whatever, and they'd gradually evolve and so on. So anyway, so those are a couple of theories of like group dynamics. A great movie to watch, I'm not going to show it in this class because I show it in my other class, is 12 Angry Men. It's also 12 Angry Men. And maybe I'll show you the trailer.
I watched that and I did, I think, a play on that in high school.
Did you like it?
Yeah, it was good. My teacher, she reenacted like the courtroom scene.
Cool. Well, it's been used in business schools since it came out, like for 5-6 decades. It came out, I think, in 1957, so it's been 65 years since it appeared as a black and white film. It's really a great film, and they've used it. A huge number of professors use it in business schools. I myself first saw it as an organizational behavior student back in '79, when I was getting my master's MBA degree. And I've always used it. It's really a great tool. I think more than the punctuated equilibrium model, it does a beautiful job of illustrating forming, storming, norming, and performing. It really does. And so where's my so trouble with this laptop with the okay, Safari. So where is that? How do I get into there? So let's see. 12 Angry Men. It's sometimes listed as one of the 100 best movies ever made and so on.
On the point of that knife, a man's life is at stake.
I'm just saying it's possible.
And I say it's not possible. I want you to watch this because I don't want to have to do it again. I'll make myself about 6 or 7 inches shorter, okay?
It's about right, maybe a little more.
Okay, a little more.
What's on? Here's what I think happened.
How can I be positive about anything?
I don't understand you people. I mean, all these picky little points you keep bringing up, they don't mean nothing.
You are going to try a man for murder. The awesome convict will suddenly be thrust into your hands. Watch them and pray, for someday you may become one of them. 12 men with the smell of violent death in their nostrils.
What's the matter with you guys? You're letting them slip through our fingers. Slip through our fingers? Are you his executioner?
You cut it.
Ever since you walked into this room, you've been acting like a self-appointed public avenger. Shut up. You're a sadist.
12 men turned into 12 clawing animals.
So anyway, it's a terrible trailer, but in any case, it makes it seem a lot more sort of action than it is. It's really about group formation, and you can pretty much, a lot of the ideas of that we're talking about in class, stuff like the role of norms, the role of group size, the role of status, even to a degree. Role perceptions, all these kinds of things, are really beautifully illustrated in that movie. And so basically, the problem of group structure includes stuff like roles, norms, status, the size of the group, the cohesion of the group. Basically, all of these dimensions of group behavior have been analyzed and studied over the years by OB scholars. And we'll start with roles. A role is just a set of expected behaviors or patterns attributed to someone who occupies a given position. So you expect certain roles of people you deal with. I once read in research about education, for example, that the role of professor, that the undergraduates prefer to have professionalism rather than a friend. They don't want a professor who's their friend. They want a professor who treats them professionally. And so the role expectations of a professor is a certain degree, of professionalism. And we all have these expectations. And a lot of times, this idea, this Irving Goffman kind of mindset applies to jobs and organizations and professions, that we expect people to behave in a certain way, and so they fulfill our expectations. Part of it is that people themselves have role perceptions. They themselves think, I think a professor should do this. I think a professor should give homework. I think a professor should grade your papers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That people have role perceptions of their own roles. It's also true that outsiders, other people, have expectations, role expectations of how people are supposed to behave. So you have certain expectations of how a doctor is supposed to behave, or how a professor is supposed to behave. And if those expectations are violated, you're going to be unhappy. You're going to feel they're not doing a good job. You say to the waiter, I'd like a glass of water, please. And the waiter, ignores you or something. And, you get upset. They didn't abide by your norms. And so a lot of what goes on in organizations is not so much getting the job done as people living up to others' expectations of their roles. And this is related to the idea of psychological contracts, unwritten agreements that establish expectations between parties. And a lot of what goes on in companies has to do with the psychological contracts. And this includes stuff in HR, as well as private relationships within departments, how managers expect people lower down on the chain of command to behave, how people lower down on the chain of command expect people higher on the chain of command to behave, how outside gig workers expect to be treated by their employer. And so basically, a lot of what happens is linked to equity theory, which I think I mentioned before. And the idea of equity theory is that people have an expectation of outcomes, or they expect certain outcomes from the effort they're putting in. So they make social comparisons between themselves and the people around them. So the inputs that they give, they expect to have certain outcomes based on their comparisons with their peers. So the ratio of inputs to outcomes should be equal across the people you're around. You make social comparisons. But what if they're not equal? Then this causes cognitive dissonance, which is exactly the same thing as breaking a psychological contract. That, in other words, people who have psychological contracts with each other expect certain things. And if they don't get those things, then they're shocked. And this is in part why confidence artists, con artists are people who cheat other people for a living, why they're able to get away with what they get away with. Because in society, we have certain expectations, like somebody wears a police uniform, we expect them to be a police officer. If somebody is wearing a IBM repair uniform, I think they wear suits, but the idea is there that if they come in and they say they're from IBM and they behave like IBM, that we expect them to be IBM repair people. And so we attribute certain roles to people in the world. If you know how to press the right buttons and make people think that you are playing that role, then they will expect certain things from you. And if they do, then they'll assume you're going to do things, even if they have no reason to think that. And that's exactly what a con artist does. They show people like they cause people to expect a certain program, but the program is, only in the mind of the people they're showing to, so they convince them that they can play a certain role. And then the people they're conning start to expect them to play that role, and then they trust them to play that role, and that's where they get taken advantage of. So that's why I just saw this really great movie. It's actually a series on Netflix called Inventing Anna. I highly recommend it. I think it's Inventing Anna or Creating Anna, something like that. And basically, I'll Google it and make sure. And basically, it's about a con artist in New York, and she is able to fool, even though she's quite young. She's able to fool a lot of the top bankers. Yeah, it came right up. I just heard Watch Inventing Anna on Netflix. Highly recommended. I think you can learn a lot about business. I'm not trying to encourage you guys to be confidence artists. That's not at all my intention. I'm kind of showing you how to be wary of them. Do I think that's a way to be successful? No, I think what happened to her is probably par, that she got caught and eventually went to jail. So it didn't work. But what I'm saying is that if you can understand how to convince people that you're something, then they will believe you're that thing. And that's a very good sales technique. The example I always like to give is that of Cary Grant. I know you guys probably never heard of Cary Grant. Did anyone in the class ever hear of Cary Grant? Just, you can speak up if you feel like it. Anyone ever hear of him? Occasionally someone has. No one knows anyone? I haven't. Okay, so anyway, Cary Grant was this great actor who lived in he was famous from, say, the 1930s to the 1960s. And he made a lot of very memorable movies. Some of them are among the best, considered the best movies ever produced. What's interesting about Cary Grant, in fact, I can show you a trailer for North by Northwest, which he stars in, and I think it's a maybe top 40, top 50 movie of all time. And basically, his story was that he came from a lower class family in England, and his father deserted his mother at an early age. His mother was institutionalized for mental illness, and he didn't know she was alive until after he became famous, at which point he flew to England and took care of her. He didn't even know she was around. And he grew up he ran away from home at an early age and joined an acting group. And when he came to America, he started from scratch as an immigrant, with certain advantages, the chief of which was that, as you'll see, he is a very good-looking specimen. So basically, he had the advantage of really great looks, but he spoke with a very lower-class English accent. In England, your accent is important to identification of your social class. It's true here too, incidentally, but less so than in England. And when he came here, he married one of the richest women in America at that time. She was a double heiress. Her name was Barbara Woolworth Hutton. And on her mother's side, she was I guess it was on her mother's side. She was the Woolworth heiress. Woolworth's was a big department store, like a chain store, kind of like a Walmart now. And it went under years ago, but the Woolworth building in Manhattan is still there. And on her father's side, E.F. Hutton was a famous stock brokerage that also closed a number of years ago, but basically she had double fortunes. And he married this Barbara Hutton, and he spent several years observing her friends, and he learned to copy how they behaved and how they spoke and everything else. And in a lot of his movies, like the Philadelphia Story, he's known as like he plays upper class roles. Like you can't really identify whether his accent is like English accent, American accent, but it's like very high sounding accent. And he played that role, but his natural origin was quite different. And my only point is that you can create these images for yourself. And I think that's extremely important in business. So, this is something they don't usually teach you in school, but basically, I think you can learn all this. So anyway, if you look at it, so what I'm saying is that people have certain expectations. So if you write in a certain way, or you speak in a certain way, you look a certain part, they have certain expectations about what you're going to do. And then they'll make assumptions about you. In this movie, Inventing Anna, basically, she learned that she studied this from early childhood. And what motivated her, I don't know, but some people just have these kinds of inclinations. And basically, this is pretty much the same idea of what Cary Grant did. So basically, anyone could do it. But you say, well, why would I? Well, because, if you're eager to become successful in the business world, you can change how people perceive you by cultivating certain images. And so this is what people do politically in organizations, is that they learn to mirror the people around them. And so they adapt to their environment. And because people trust people who are like them, if you learn to adapt to your organizational environment and become like the people you work with, they like you more. So I forget if I mentioned in this class, with another class, that I once had a student who came up to me after I gave a talk like this, and he said, this was at NYU, and he said he had gone to work at a bank, and everyone else at the bank was a sports fan except for him. And he realized it was a liability. So he went out and he subscribed to Sports Illustrated and other sports publications. And he began studying sports and watching sports, and he became a sports fan himself. And then he said that was very, very conducive to being successful socially in the organization, which in turn leads to, of course, getting promoted. So basically, this idea of mirroring is a critical political tool. So basically what I'm saying is that you're not a con artist, but you can use what the same tricks or patterns that con artists use in order to advantage yourself in an organization. Now, one of the real hallmarks of groups that makes something a group is that it has norms. Like if you look at 12 Angry Men, you saw that the trailer was not really what the movie is like, but what the story is they're all very conflictual, and they're told that they have to convict someone if there's not a reasonable doubt. But if there is a reasonable doubt, then they're not supposed to convict someone. So this should create the norm for a criminal jury in America, reasonable doubt. And so basically, when they come in, what governs them is not so much reasonable doubt, but several different norms. One of them is racial prejudice. One of them is a feeling that the evidence is overwhelming and the accused has to be guilty, and there are a couple other norms, but the chief one, I think there were two big norms that battle each other, and that's really what the story is about. The norm of a fair trial versus the norm of racial prejudice or ethnic prejudice. They don't, in the movie, they don't really tell you the race of, in the screenplay they do, but in the movie, they don't identify the race of the accused. And they never mention it. They don't talk about it, but they talk about the guy's race, and they talk about it. But what it kind of does is create this sort of feeling of universality, that it could be anyone accusing anyone of anything. And so basically, this battle of norms has to be resolved. And the thing is, all groups have norms, all groups have standards of behavior. The norms in college is you listen to the professor. The norm in the military is you say yes, sir, to the to the drill sergeant. The norm in in a jazz concert is that each musician gets a chance to improvise, and so on. There's every group, any group will have norms. Sometimes the norms, the standards of behavior are social. Like all societies have certain laws or norms. Like when you go to a vacation resort, you pay your bill. You don't run off without paying your bill. It's just expected that people are honest. But part of it's also beliefs about what's good, and attitudes towards outsiders. And in groups, there's always a lot of pressure to conform. Okay, so basically conformity to norms is characteristic of groups. And this is a very important point, because when I talk about the assets and liabilities of group problem solving in a few minutes, this thing that people tend to conform to norms, in part because it's politically advantageous, as I was saying just a minute ago, that mirroring and fitting in to the group will not only help you in the short run, but if you fit in well consistently, it can lead to success. This was the insight of the great anthropologist, William F. White, who wrote a book called Street Corner Society. And what he did in Street Corner Society is he participated in a street gang in Boston for several years, and he treated it as an anthropological study. So basically, he lived with this Boston street gang, and observed who became the leader, how they interacted, what was prestigious, and so on. And he wrote this incredible anthropological study of the Boston street gang. And it had a big effect on organizational theory, because what he really showed was that the person who became the leader was the one who conformed most closely to the group norms. And so if you fit the norms expectations, this is part of the controversy of Trump, was that he totally violated the norms. He was tweeting and twittering and, all kinds of crudeness and so on. And this violated norms, and it really aggravated a lot of people. And so basically, there's a lot of expectations that presidents will adhere to certain normative expectations. And it's true of any leader, whether you're the president of a corporation or the leader of a club on campus. There's certain role expectations and conformity that's expected. Cultural norms also play a big role. So in other words, group norms are norms that are established by the group. So, in a film like 12 O'Clock High, it shows the jury arriving at different decision-making processes, when to have a secret ballot, when not to have a secret ballot, who the leader of the group is, and so on. In society, there are also cultural norms which interact with the group norms. And so, if you look at the Hofstede cultural dimensions we talked about earlier, so things like individualism versus collectivism, or masculinity versus femininity in a culture, that these norms are going to affect how employees interact with the organization. So in international organizations, there's this added variable of cultural differences interacting. When I worked with Inco, there was always a lot of conflict. The top management was Canadian, and they ran a plant in Great Britain, and there was often conflict between the British employees and the Canadians. And the Canadians wanted one thing, and the British guys wanted something else, and so this was two cultures that were closely connected. I mean, they're almost as close as they can be, Canada and Great Britain. America and Canada might be a little bit closer, but all three countries are pretty closely linked. But there were big cultural differences even there. And there's someone once called Canada, Canada and the United States are two countries separated by a common border. And people have said similar things about the US and Britain, that two countries separated by a common language. And so basically, there are going to be huge cultural differences, even where the countries are almost the same. Austrians, I was talking to my wife about when I went to Germany when I was in college, I remembered the German that Austrians spoke was a lot different from the German that the Bavarians, I was in Munich, that the Bavarians spoke. And I mentioned to my wife, who's German speaking, and she said, "Oh God, yeah, the Austrians hate the Germans." I said, "What? The Austrians hate the Germans?" I never had that picture, but that's often the case, that two people, when countries are similar to each other, is when they dislike each other. Well, I guess Ukraine and Russia, what we're seeing nowadays is a similar kind of story. So basically, cultural norms will often interact with organizational norms and create deviant kinds of patterns. Status in a group results from power. So how much power someone has, the ability to contribute and to produce for the group, and personal characteristics such as appearance. Perceived status inequities can be disruptive. So if someone feels that they're better trained than someone else, or someone feels that they're at a higher status, and then someone who they perceive as lower status is given authority over them, or somehow, if you look at the story of the Manhattan Project, there was sometimes tension between the scientists who were all geniuses, like the top physicists, Enrico Fermi and so on, with the military guys supervising them, who are, more within the normal range of intelligence, and not trained nuclear physicists. So basically, there was at times tension there. So basically, perceived status inequity can cause disruption to the group. As far as the size of the group, creative groups are better with a dozen or more members. So like if you have a very large group and you want creativity, you're in a good position. Smaller groups are better for performance. So if you want a group that gets things done, you have a small group. If you want a group that's very large, you are going to be more creative, but it's going to be harder to get things done. So basically, if you compare, for instance, the president and the Congress, House of Representatives, I mean to say, has 420 members, I think it is, and the president is one. So basically, the executive can get things done. The president can get things done. Congress is a debating club to a greater degree. but you have a lot more creativity in Congress than you do. The presidents aren't usually famous for their creativity, they're famous for execution. That's why they're called executives, they execute. Whereas Congress is more of a debating club. And I once worked for the New York State Assembly, and I remember I was writing up with one of the assemblymen, and he looked at me and he said, well, back to Alice in Wonderland, and that's kind of the feeling of legislative bodies, that they're all always talking about. I remember one guy, I was the analyst. One of the things I was the analyst for was the State Athletic Commission, and this guy comes to me, and my Senate counterpart, and he said, I think it's time we legalize boxing in New York. And I said, you're crazy. There's going to be like, the boxing people are going to go ballistic, the organized boxing in New York. It ended up leaving New York anyway for Las Vegas, but, legalizing it outright wasn't, in my feeling, the right thing to do. But in any case, the final structural concept I want to talk about is cohesion. Cohesion is where members of the groups share bonds. So the group feels that they stick together. What makes like a group feel like they're really part of each other? Maybe sometimes you've been at times in life where you've had a few friends you felt like you had a lot in common with, and you did a lot with them. So there was a great deal of cohesion. And basically, cohesion isn't always useful. For professors, I don't think cohesion really matters a lot unless they're working on a common research project. I don't think research creativity comes from a high degree of cohesion. I mean, it can if you work together with people and you become cooperative, but overall, often independent thinking is more productive than working in a group. Companies like teams. Okay, so basically teams have a lot of assets and companies tend to like those assets, but teams, they can be more creative. So in the advertising world, they love brainstorming is where you generate ideas. No one evaluates the ideas. You don't criticize. You try to encourage wild ideas. The group builds on each other's ideas. So you spit out a lot of ideas and the leader writes them down. And then the group may vote on what the best idea is. The thing is, in that type of problem solving, they're going to come up with a better solution than the majority of people would have found, but they may not come up with the solution that the best person in the group would have found. So like you don't see like major theoretical breakthroughs usually being the product of a group. Occasionally it'll be two people like Watson and Crick, DNA discovery. But you think of the invention of a lot of the stuff we take for granted, like the AC motor by Nikola Tesla, the AC induction system, that was an individual. Tesla was an individual. Einstein, the theory of relativity, Newton, Newtonian physics and the law of gravity, Edison. Well, he used groups more, but a lot of his stuff probably came as well as individual breakthroughs. So basically, individuals can be really good. Gauss, great mathematician. A lot of breakthroughs can be attributed to individuals, to Tesla-like individuals. But when you're dealing with mid-range creativity, I think group performance is better. So like a group like IDEO, a company called IDEO, is famous for their creative design process. And they've designed a lot of the stuff. They designed the computer mouse and all kinds of stuff that we use in technology. They're based in Palo Alto in the Silicon Valley area. And they designed a lot of the stuff we use, all kinds of stuff, not just computer related, like, toys and toothpaste, toothbrushes, and you name it. And if you look at their process, it's largely based on brainstorming, and they come up with great ideas, and they pool their ideas and come up with great ideas. The problem is that I don't think that kind of creativity is good for like the seminal breakthrough, the earth-shattering breakthrough of Albert Einstein or Nikola Tesla. I don't think that kind of creativity goes to that extreme. I think it goes to like, designing new products that are innovative and fresh. So I think this kind of brainstorming or another thing is the nominal group technique I'll talk about in a second, that these kind of approaches are valuable and they help, but they're never going to change the universe. What changes the universe is, the individual genius. And they don't like, they don't want to admit that. The people who believe in group problem solving think that that's the only way. And a lot of people in corporations heavily prefer group processes. And there are good reasons for it. Groups, first of all, bring a diversity of views. So you have more people working on a problem, you have different opinions. You have more complete information because you have more information sets to add to the group. You also have a diversity of approaches. The guy that wrote the article that this stuff is based on, Mayer, his name is, argued that there are more heuristics, more problem-solving approaches in the group than the individual. And also, if group members participate in a problem-solving process, then they will accept the solution. So if you want people to buy into a solution, have them participate in making the decision. And then they can't turn around and say, oh, I don't like that decision because they participated in making the decision. I'm not saying can't, but they're less likely. The weaknesses of a group are, I think, also important and equally important. One that I don't think is that critical is time consuming. Clearly, it takes a lot more time to make a group decision. So if you have to act fast, it's not a team decision. The military can't function on group decision making. So if you're in a war, you're in a shooting war, and you're up against an enemy, you can't sit down and collaborate. You have to have a commander who tells you what to do. And you have to trust that the commander will know what's best. And that's going to be strict, because if you break that, it can kill everybody. So basically, time consuming is a problem with groups. More important in business, I think, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, is conformity. That if the benefit of a group is complete information, diversity of approaches, diversity of views, that if people all conform to one person's opinion, then that all the advantages of the group are gone, and you might as well just have individual problem solving. So basically, conformity pressure, and that's beautifully illustrated in 12 Angry Men. You can see it all over the place, as are the strengths of group problem solving. So, initially you see, and this gets us to another weakness of group problem solving: dominance of individuals, dominance of a few members. So if you have some aggressive personalities or strong personalities, they kind of push the others into conforming to what the others want them to conform to. And so basically, the domination of a few members ruins a group. But I'd say the biggest problem is, and it's related to domination of a few members, is conformity. So if the group, starts to just adopt the views of a few people, then it stops being a useful tool, and you might as well disband it. A famous researcher, maybe you've heard of him, Solomon Asch, wrote did a a really famous study, series of studies, and what he did was he would show. I'm showing you the whiteboard. He would show them a card with 3 lines, one of which, 2 of which were the same length. I'm not doing this too well, but you have the idea. 2 of which were the same length and 1 of which was shorter. And the test subject would think that everyone at the table was also a test subject. So they all seem the same. They all seem like college students or whatever. But basically, only one person was a test subject. The others were all Confederates of Solomon Ash. And so he would show this card, and people would say, well, the middle line is shorter. We'll call it B. All right. Everyone would agree that B is shorter, and then he'd send it around again, and they'd say, B is shorter. And then he would send another card, and they'd all be different, but let's say he sent this card around, and then everyone would say A is shorter, even though A is longer. So, oh, it's A, of course, A. And so they would get to the last, they wouldn't be last, but, towards the end or in the middle, and they'd see what the test subject would say. Would he say B, the obvious answer, or would he say what the Confederates were saying? And basically, he found that 30 to 60% of the time they would say A, not B. All right, so and of course, if you've been following some of the research on monkeys, you know that a monkey would be way smarter than to say B. So basically, people are willing to function at below the level of a monkey simply to conform. All right, so basically, it's a huge problem with groups. One of the big political illustrations of this was a book by Irving Janis. Well, I have the whiteboard out. I'll put it on the whiteboard. That Irving Janis wrote this book called Groupthink. It's a political science book, but it has huge organizational implications. And the story in the book, I mean, it's a political science book, and he talks about, it's mostly about a case study of the Kennedy administration. And so he observed the Kennedy administration, and he interviewed people in it, one of whom was Arthur Schlesinger, who is a famous historian who taught at Harvard and then CUNY. And Arthur Schlesinger described the cabinet meeting where the invasion of Cuba by Cuban civilians was discussed. It was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. And he basically said that when he wasn't part of the cabinet, of course, but he was there as an observer, Arthur Schlesinger. Kennedy, I guess because of the Harvard Association or something, invited him in. And he said to someone, "This is the craziest thing I ever heard. I mean, that Cuban civilians are going to invade Cuba." And of course, it turned out to be disastrous, embarrassment. Many of them were imprisoned and killed and so on. And one of the people in the meeting looked at him and said, "Please don't sabotage the president's thinking." And so someone who questioned this bizarre strategy that turned out to be a complete failure and was evidently one from the beginning, was told to be quiet. And Janis uses this as an entree into a lengthy, most of the book is about the Vietnam War. And you're going to read, not read, but you're going to watch The Fog of War by Robert McNamara. And McNamara was one of the players in the decision to invade Vietnam. So he was there every step of the way. He was the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson. And so basically, what Janice describes is that there was this groupthink. The title of his book is Groupthink. And the idea of groupthink is that it's an intense kind of conformity pressure where the group becomes paranoid. It becomes like an us and them mentality. And the group homogeneity becomes far, far stronger than is normally the case. Not that it's not normally strong, but it becomes very powerful. And so basically what this can do is cause groups to agree to very stupid decisions. It's not that different from, I think I mentioned already, the book by Charles Mackay, who is a famous, I mean, the book was a famous book that was written in the 19th century. And Mackay, it was called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And by Mackay, I think he spelled, let me check that spelling, Mackay, I believe it's that. And basically, what Mackay describes is a host of superstitions and the Salem witch trials. And he also talks about tulipomania. So basically here, let me put this on the, I'll show you the book, you can look it up. I highly recommend it. It's a quick read, not that hard to read book. And this thing of tulipomania is the idea that in Holland, there was a lot of silver coming into Holland because they minted the silver that the Spanish stole from the Peruvian Indians, Peruvian people. And basically, because of this influx of wealth, they began speculating the way we do now. This was one of the earliest inventions, earliest occurrences of mass modern speculation. And Mackay talks about the speculative frenzy of tulip bulbs. And what, okay, so where am I? I've got a map here. That's not what I want to show you. What I wanted to show you was Charles Mackay. So this is the book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, the classic guide to crowd psychology, financial folly, and surprising superstition. And this was written in the 19th century, and it's still a great book. There was an update to it in the 1960s, I think it was, or 70s, by a guy named Kindleberger, who yeah, I think that's manias, panics, and crashes. And it's basically an update of Mackay, but put into the context of financial markets, which is obviously one of the big areas where manias occur. And of course, a lot of people want to understand manias. And I remember around 2000, at the time of the internet bubble, when the internet stocks were all at astronomical valuations. This was already 22 years ago. It's ancient history to you. Some of you weren't born yet. Basically, I went to the editor-in-chief of The Economist in New York, the editor or whatever he was, of The Economist in New York, The Economist magazine, based in London. gave a talk on the internet bubble, and I remember attending it, and he mentioned Kindleberger, and basically we've seen this occur repeatedly, most recently with some of you probably invested in Bitcoin and Ethereum and all that kind of stuff. And basically cryptocurrency, I'm sure there's some true believers in the class who get mad at me for saying it's like tulipomania, but basically it may not be. I don't really know. I'm not saying not to buy it or to buy it, but it's gone through these bubbles periodically, and I'm not recommending not to buy it. I actually bought some when it fell to 20,000. I bought a little. If it falls to 10 or 15, I might buy a little more. I'm not going to put a lot of money into it, but it could go to zero as far as I'm concerned. But I don't mind speculating to a tiny degree. But in any case, it's the same thing. Now, why is Bitcoin valuable? For the same reason that tulips were popular in Holland, that they bid up the price of tulips to thousands of dollars a plant, a bulb. Why did that happen? Because these things catch on, people imitate each other. And the same thing is true of groups, that that attitudes are contagious, that people copy each other. And of course, you can consciously mimic how other people behave, and that can be profitable to you. But you will also at times be unconsciously sucked into making the mistake of behaving like other people. And I don't have to tell you that crowd psychology can be very destructive. Like the lynch mobs of 19th century America, for example. And there are countless examples of that throughout history, where people became obsessed with bloodlust and all kinds of insane behavior, scapegoating minorities and lots of other things. And basically it's all the same. It's all groupthink. It's all conformity. It all has it's all related. I'm not saying exactly the same, but so basically you have to ask yourself, if you're in a company that's engaging in groupthink, that everyone's thinking the same way. They assume the same set of moral standards. They assume that anyone outside their group, anyone who's not in our party is immoral, is a traitor, is evil, and this is where part of authoritarianism and totalitarianism comes from, is this attitude towards outsiders. But it happens in companies too, that this department becomes, it's us against them, and it results in counterproductive behavior. A similar process occurs within groups, and I've seen this many times in life, called group shift. And the idea of group shift is that when a group adopts a norm, people start to outshine each other to show that they're holier than thou. And so they become more emphatic about their norms. And so they take their norms to the nth degree, becomes unrealistic. Like I once had a teacher from Yale who had gone to Yale, and he used to say, "Don't remind me of a Harvard man who follows his argument over the side of a cliff." And so basically, this is what they do. They follow their arguments over the side of a cliff. And so, they become so extreme in their positions. But in reality, any one point of view always should be temperate. That the way to good decisions is balance. It's never the most extreme version of some idea. But what happens is that because the idea becomes popular, the group shift leads to people becoming more emphatic about the adopting the view. So they're more holy, more religious, if you will, than the other people. And so everyone's competing to show how much they excel on this point of view, and it results in stupid decisions. And so basically you don't want to do that. A very good guide to this sort of question is still Aristotle, who wrote the Nicomachean Ethics 2,500 years ago. And it's still amazing. I mean, what he basically says in there is that there are a number of virtues, there are lots of virtues, and he goes over a lot of the main ones, and that the virtues are generally examples of soprosune, the Greek for moderation, for temperance. And so basically you don't want to go to the extremes in any one virtue, but rather to balance virtues. And so you go for the midpoint. And so if one party gains an advantage in a negotiation that's unfair to the other party, and if the other party gains an advantage in the negotiation, it's unfair to the first party. But if they reach a fair deal, it's right in the middle. So that's what's temperate. That's what's moderate. And he goes over a whole bunch of virtues, like ranging from not just justice and moderation and prudence and so on, and smaller virtues and bigger virtues, and some virtues are particular to certain roles, like if you are a wealthy person, then magnificence, like paying for the religious festival for the whole town, is expected. That's a virtue for you. But if you're not that wealthy, paying for the religious festival for the whole town would be imprudent. It would be rash or imprudent. So basically, virtues are appropriate to certain stations and certain levels of where you are. You have different kinds of virtues. A young person's virtues are not going to be an old person's virtues. And so basically what Aristotle's saying is that you find the balance appropriate to who you are. And so this, does he say that it's wrong to make money? No, money, he has nothing against money. The Greeks, of course, were a feudal society. They were an ancient society. They didn't understand capitalism. They didn't understand economics. Although Aristotle was very at the very rudiments, he was starting to understand it, that the idea that there's like a price that's you can negotiate. And Athens had a relatively free economy, and they invited in immigrants, and they relied on foreigners to do a lot of the business, but they themselves were not interested in that. They were aristocrats, they wanted to be aristocrats. They were landowners. But in any case, I think we can apply that kind of sense of virtue to groups, and to not allow the group to understand that we need to fit the group and conform and fit in and work with the group, but at the same time that we don't let the group think for us, and we don't become susceptible to groupthink. And if we do, then what happens is the shame of somebody like Robert McNamara, who agreed later that they were wrong, that they made bad decisions. And another really great book on that topic, before I let you go, is it's also been used in OB classes a lot. I'm not going to use it, but it's a great case study. A chapter, or there's two chapters in the book by David Halberstam called it's called The Best and the Brightest. And the chapters, I think it's 12 and 13, the chapters about Robert McNamara are amazing. And since you're going to be watching his interview, you could take a look at those. Janice in Groupthink also discusses McNamara and the other people. Basically, you could make the argument that it was groupthink. You could make the argument that it was sheer stupidity. That basically, in the end, at the end of the chapter, Halberstam just says, he starts out by saying that McNamara, is this incredible mind. He finished almost first in his class at Berkeley, and he, I think he was like the first one or two people in his class in Berkeley, and he got a professorship at Harvard Business School, and he was then recruited into being a statistician for this guy Tex Thornton, who was running the statistical ops group for the U.S. military during World War II. And they're the ones, I think I mentioned already, that determined that the plane should fly at 9,000 feet, which is depicted in 12 o'clock high. They're the ones that determined that using statistical modeling. And, so then he went on to become CEO of Ford Motor Company and did all kinds of incredible things there. And then was tapped right after he became president of Ford by Kennedy to be the Secretary of Defense. And the thing about McNamara was that he implied, he wanted to apply statistics to everything. He was a statistician and he wanted to apply statistical decision-making to everything, and it didn't really work. That a lot of decisions in the military can't be based on the law of large numbers. There's too many particularities, and it didn't work. And basically, what Halberstam says in the end, he says, in short, McNamara was a fool, and that's how he ends the chapter. And so, whether it was conformity pressure, whether it was sheer stupidity, whether it was a valid decision-making process, they just made mistakes. Different people have different views on what happened there, but basically, it's a classic example of failed organizational decision-making processes. And how do you overcome that groupthink? How do you overcome that kind of conformity? Your book talks about brainstorming, which I mentioned already, and there's a great video by IDEO. I'll send you the link to it, where IDEO, it was made over 20 years ago, so it's in some ways dated. Like some of the technology they show is old-fashioned, but it's like 20 years ago. But basically, what they depict is them designing a new shopping cart, which actually is a huge improvement over the existing shopping carts in most places till today. And they showed the decision-making process they used, and it was basically based on brainstorming, not groupthink, the opposite of groupthink, brainstorming. So it's a great video, and I think it captures like how you can make groups more creative. I think the question is, do most companies want creativity? And I think the answer is no, they do not. Most companies don't care about creativity. They want people who fit in, who do what they say, who come up with solutions that complement the boss. One last technique I'll mention, the nominal group technique, which your book talks about. A lot of OB classes discuss this, and basically the nominal group technique is where it's similar to brainstorming, except it's done at a distance. So the individuals record their ideas, they present, each one presents an idea, the ideas are recorded, then they ask people to clarify their ideas, but don't criticize them. And then the members of the group rank order the ideas. And so they try to come up with an optimal process without being critical. If you look at the history of creativity, almost all really good ideas have been heavily criticized. They've been called ridiculous. If you look at the biography of Tesla, when he said he was working on AC current and the an AC motor, his engineering professor in Serbia said or maybe it was France, I can't remember the country, he may have gone to another country to go to school. His engineering professor said, it's a perpetual motion scheme. The idea of AC electricity is ridiculous. And then he went on not too long after that to invent the AC induction system, which powers all of our appliances. And Tesla had that otherworldly quality where a lot of his ideas, it was as though he came from another dimension and came up with these ideas. The thinking was so different from how people normally think. But in any case, that's a lot of what creativity is. It's like thinking in a bizarre way. And often people with a great deal of creativity are going to be called foolish. It's going to be laughed at. The thing is, when you're trying to be creative in an organization, you have to restrain yourself. There's countless examples of where employees have suggested ideas to their company. One of the really great ones is Fred Smith, the guy who founded Federal Express, FedEx. And I think I told you his favorite management movie is 12 O'Clock High. I once emailed him about it, he emailed me back, and he said he couldn't make it to my class, but he appreciated the invitation. But basically, Fred Smith was also a Yale student, and he wrote a business plan for Federal Express as a senior paper. And his professor gave him a C and said it was a ridiculous idea. It's based on science fiction, which I think it was actually. And he then went on to found Federal Express and became one of the richest people in the country. And his company is American icon, a global icon. Movies have been made about it, and so on. And so basically, he was laughed at, and virtually every other great innovator was also laughed at. So when you create group problem-solving processes, you have to train the people not to criticize, do not criticize ideas, and instead build on the ideas. This is very, very important. All right, that said, we are 10 minutes late. So I'm gonna say goodnight to you. Are there any questions that anyone might have about material or anything coming up?
I just wanted to check with you. Did you might have said something about an extension for today's assignment?
I did. I put it in the chat, and I did say it at the beginning that I'm giving you 2 extra days for the discussion board that's required on the aircraft brake scandal, the wonderful case by Kermit Vanderveer, which first appeared as an article in Harper's Magazine in the early 1970s. And it's a classic whistleblowing case. It happened to him. He's writing about it in the first person or second person. So he was a player. And I think you can do a lot. You look at the decision-making processes there and how the team functioned and how the group malfunctioned based on power differential, status, all the bad stuff that causes groupthink, that causes conformity pressure. And he stood up to it and got fired. Okay, so basically the ones who conform are the ones who succeed, even in a bad situation like that. And there was criminality. They deserve to go to jail, really, but that's not what happened. So take a look at that and write up the discussion board on it, and it'll be due on Tuesday night. Any other
Hey,
questions?
Professor.
Yes.
The essay, the one-page essay that we have to do, it's due on the 30th, yeah?
Yes, the paper is due. Do you have any questions about the paper? I've gone over it once or twice, but maybe you still have some questions.
It's straightforward, right? Just find something in the book, in the textbook, and write about it.
Show
And
how
come at
12
it.
o'clock high illustrates this concept.
12 o'clock high. Okay.
All right, so you have to read the textbook and you have to watch 12 o'clock high and then apply the textbook to 12 o'clock high.
Okay. Yeah, I could do that.
Good. I know you can. I'm sure you'll do a great job. Okay, anyone else? Other questions? Anyone? All right, if you still have questions, I'll turn the